Good afternoon. I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to a conversation with Dr. Raghuram Rajan, the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India and a former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. He's a renowned expert in his field and is currently the Catherine Rozak Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago. Dr. Rajan has devoted his professional life to the study and practice of financial institutions in fostering economic development. He was prescient in warning about risks that threaten the global financial system 3 years before the 2008 global financial crisis. In 2013, as governor of the Reserve Bank of India, he helped stabilize and instill momentum into the Indian economy during a time when India faced double-digit inflation, a weakening of the rupee, and a plunging stock market. He's a prolific writer, and today we have the opportunity to hear from him on his latest book, The Third Pillar, which looks at how the state and markets impact the communities we live in. I would like to say that at the conclusion of the program, he will be available to sign books outside for those interested. We are honored to host Dr. Rajan here at Johns Hopkins SAIS in conversation with Dr. John Lipsky, the Peter G. Peterson Distinguished Scholar at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs and a Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Raghuram Rajan to the podium.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm going to look here for what advances this. Let me get to the meat of the book. We have this standard view of capitalism, right? Capitalism is largely about markets, and typically, if you're at Chicago, that's about all you need. If you're outside, maybe you need a little more. Sometimes we talk about the role of the government. And the government is there to enforce contracts and property rights. That's about where we stop. And much of the 20th century was deciding the relative role of governments and markets. Some ideologies said more government, some ideologies said more markets. But essentially, it was a back and forth between the two, between the political and the economic side, and how much one should dominate the other. And, as I started thinking about the malaise that seem to afflict capitalism today, I wondered if this was all that we should be thinking about. And it struck me that much of our discussion really indirectly was about a third pillar, that is the community. And the idea is that the community, both directly, because it supports people before they enter markets, it helps in their learning, it helps in them getting better nutrition, better ability to operate in the markets. So that's what I call pre-market support. But also, if they fall off the markets, to hold them up. For example, in the Great Recession, many in Southern Europe ran out of unemployment insurance because there was deep unemployment for a long period of time. What did they do when they ran out of their own savings? They ran out of any insurance they had. They went back to their families. They went back to their villages. They went back to their community. So in a sense, the community provides both pre-market support, nurtures you, helps you grow to participate in markets, also picks up the pieces when you fall off and helps you put them together again. And also through democracy, because the proximate community is often the basic building block of democracy, it makes capitalism work for the many. Now, when capitalism works for the many, there's broad democratic support. And I would argue that these sort of three pillars in balance created perhaps the most successful wealth-creating machine we've seen, which was the liberal market democracy. Worked very well in the post-war years until, recently, there's no question that we were, quote unquote, at the end of history as far as systems went. But of course, what we've seen in recent years is a perturbation in the balance. Something is not working out. People are unhappy. And interestingly, this is coming at a time when, by aggregate measures, 3.7% unemployment in the US, inflation 2%. The misery index, which was coined during the Carter regime, when inflation was really high, unemployment was very high, the sum of the two was called the misery index. Well, the misery index is not miserable anymore. It's actually quite good. And in this kind of environment, why are people so unhappy? And the answer has to be that not everybody experiences this wonderful environment, that it's more differentiated. And one of the interesting things you see in the IMF's recent World Economic Outlook, John Lipsky and I are alumnus of that organization. And what you see is the top 10% decile, top 10 decile of places post Great Recession are doing fantastically well. The incomes there are shooting through the roof. The bottom 10 decile is actually doing much worse than it was before the Great Recession. Now, the kind of differentiation, I will argue, is something that is new and interesting, but also a source of great concern. Let me quickly walk through the three pillars that I'm talking about. The state has its traditional functions, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. What it does for people historically has been to provide security of property and life and limb, but also justice. But in recent, in the last century, it has moved much further. It has provided pre-market support. In some countries, schools are entirely paid for by the state. In the United States, it was paid for by first the local community, and then the state government, eventually the national government also had a role. But generally, there is state involvement in paying for things like education, things like healthcare. And also, it provides post-market support. Unemployment insurance came into vogue in a number of countries. In the early part of the 20th century, we had Social Security in the US in 1935. It was earlier in Bismarck's Germany, as well as in liberal UK. So essentially, the state has expanded in a variety of ways to provide support for people going into the markets. The markets themselves have been, the traditional ones, the goods markets, labor markets, capital markets, but I also talk about firms, private firms as being part of the markets. And what a generally free market does is it finds efficient solutions to problems, to production, and enhances productivity in the economy, but also choice. It allows consumers a variety of choices. It enhances innovation. A competitive market enhances innovation. These are all the good things that markets do. But of course, they also create that volatility, which is why you need the kind of insurance that governments provide, the post-market safety net that I talked about. And finally, there's the community. And I want to talk primarily in this book about the proximate community, the neighborhood, the village, the municipality. And in this day and age, sometimes people say, why are you talking about the community? The local community is something that is dead. We in the big cities no longer experience the local community. The truth is, even in the big cities, we try and recreate our neighborhoods, the places that we belong to. There's a powerful study by Raj Chetty at Stanford earlier and now at Harvard, which shows that the community you spend your early childhood in greatly affects the earnings that you will have in your life. It's an enormous effect on those earnings. So if you move as a young child from a really poor community to a really strong community, you find an enormous change in the lifetime earnings. And that's documented very rigorously using massive data sets. And the idea is the community still has an impact. It does matter where you grow up. It does matter the kinds of life chances you've had in that community. in talking about the community, I talk largely about the proximate community in this book, but I include in that proximate community the local government and institutions like schools. Now, why would that community matter? In many ways, the community is a source of identity and values. You are, when you think of who you are, you often go back to the community you grew up in, which defines who you are. It does also fill in holes. I talked about the government providing security, justice, capabilities, and safety net. But when these run out, it is a community that provides them instead of the government. When your unemployment insurance runs out, you get effective insurance from your community. What you see here is relationships, not contracts. It's not your social contract with the government. It's not your formal contract with the insurance company, which is at work, but it is a relationship you've built within the community which makes people support you. They support you because of who you are, not because of any formal obligation that you've contracted with them. Moreover, I think the proximate community today has yet another role to play over and above these supports. It also is the basis for political organization. Often it's the smallest unit of political organization, and that is quite important in the functions it performs. Now, I'm not ruling out other forms of community. We do have virtual communities. We do have professional communities. We do have, many of us have our strongest relationships in the office. But for much of the world, this is the proximate local community is a predominant form of community, and that's what I focus on. So this is the model underlying the book. There are no formal pictures, there are no formal graphs in the book, and there are no equations. It's all prose, trust me. Hopefully understandable prose. But this is the idea, the model. And what we have are the three pillars: the state, the markets, and the community. And I've already explained the three arrows in blue. Those are the relationships between the pillars that we've already talked about. What I haven't talked about are the arrows in green, and they're very important in making the system stable. One is that markets themselves tend to exercise countervailing power over the state. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the biggest problems in free markets is to have a state which can be trusted to respect property rights, not to grab assets for its own, not to be a predatory state. Part of what makes that possible is an independent private sector which is independent of the state. Example, this administration, you have the New York Times and the Washington Post as well as Bloomberg complaining every day about the inequities perpetuated by this administration. In the previous administration, you had Fox News complaining. But these were entities that were allowed to function without, the next day the government saying, I'm going to somehow withdraw your privileges unless you step into line. That, unfortunately, is the way the press is controlled in much of the rest of the world. We're going to remove government advertisements, we're going to remove this privilege or that privilege, and that will bring you sort of back in line. The rest of the private sector, credit often is given by the government, tariffs are set by the government, a variety of regulations are in fact up for grabs, and all this makes the private sector dependent on the government. So if the private sector is dependent on the government, it cannot be an independent source of power, it cannot be a check and balance, which is why it's much easier for countries which don't have strong markets to become much more authoritarian, right? Or let me ask the question a different way. Name one socialist economy which is democratic. Democratic in the sense of freedom of the press, et cetera, et cetera. All socialist economies will pretend that they have freedom of the press, that anybody can vote the way they want. Turns out, surprisingly, they all vote only one way, right? And that's the sense in which you need this balance between the state and the markets. And similarly, the tendency of capitalism, which most of the critics of capitalism will talk about, is how capitalism tends to coalesce around a few market players and the government. It becomes crony capitalism. Capitalism's greatest critic on this dimension was actually Adam Smith. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations talks repeatedly about the tendency of business people to cartelize. and says that is the tendency we have to break. He wasn't an Ayn Rand with this somewhat glorified view of the capitalist. He valued the capitalist, but he also recognized their self-interest. And what I think democracy does is that as it comes up from the community, it basically asks for a level playing field. It is the small entrepreneur, the small business, which basically says, I don't like this cartelization. When in the 1890s, we had the first populist movement in the United States, it was farmers rising up in arms saying, we don't like the fact that the railroads are cartelized and are charging us huge rates. We don't like the fact that the banks are getting together and charging us huge interest rates. We want to break up these monopolies. And the populist movement led almost directly to the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, as well as down the line, one could argue, was what pushed eventually the United States to break up the banks under the Glass-Steagall Act in the 1930s. There is a direct line of the forces that were pushing that. So in that sense, the community periodically rises up and says, we want change, we want a more open system. Today you see that vis-a-vis big tech. You see the fears about big tech dominating the private and public sector, and you can see a democratic response. Are these guys on the up and up, or should they be regulated in a different way? And finally, the community offers values and markets to the values and norms to the market. And this is something that I will skip for the moment, but is an important factor in how change takes place. So what upsets the system? We had a system in equilibrium. What upsets the system? Historically, it's been either great calamity like the Black Death or the Great Depressions that took place, the first Great Depression, 1873 to 1893, the second one in the 30s. But also, equally important has been technological change. The first industrial revolution, the second. Most recently, it's the information and communications technology revolution. And I would argue this one is particularly important at this stage in changing the way the balance, perturbing the balance. So how has the ICT revolution changed markets? I'll then talk about how it's changed the state, and finally talk about how it's changed the community, and then we can get time for questions. So how it has changed markets is first, today the ICT revolution makes it possible to produce anything anywhere. And that's for two reasons. One, trade is transportation is much cheaper. Container ships and so on go all over the world, makes it much easier to move products around. But as important is that the ICT revolution enables you to control that production in Thailand down to the very minute. You know exactly what's going on because you get real-time data. That allows you to have more confidence in producing there, which then means you can break up the supply chain and say, each of these parts, where can it be produced best? What happens as a result? Typically, the service aspects are kept in the industrial countries, the R&D, the design, as well as the marketing and finance. What goes to be produced elsewhere is the production part, which can be done quite cheaply elsewhere. So many of you know the Apple sort of phone, at least one of the versions, costs $1,000. How much do you actually keep of it in the United States because of all the R&D design that Apple does? Actually around $700. The cost of production is $300, which probably goes to Foxconn and all its suppliers, but $700 stays here. And therefore, it's very profitable to keep the service business here, outsource the manufacturing, and effectively create a product at the cheapest price possible. Who benefits? The service workers in the United States who are highly educated, who do all the R&D and now have a global market to trade in. Who gets hurt? The manufacturing workers, who often, if it's a big plant, are localized in one or other area and are hurt by the shift, the outsourcing that takes place. What this means is, because of trade, you get a hollowing out of the middle class. But more important than trade in hollowing out the middle class is technological change. I mean, this is tax time, right? Some of you will be busy over the weekend doing your taxes. Some of you will think, well, I'm not going to hire an accountant. I'm just going to download TurboTax and do it myself. It's fairly simple. I just need to follow the instructions. And TurboTax has coded in it every arcane detail, or pretty much every arcane detail of the tax code. You don't need an accountant with everything in her mind. What you need is TurboTax. What that means is that tax accountant who used to do your taxes and basically got a rent for the knowledge they had accumulated, that knowledge is useless because it's all available online. And so automation is as important as outsourcing. In fact, 4 out of every 5 jobs are lost due to automation, 1 out of every 5 due to outsourcing. The net effect of all this is middle-class jobs are harder. There are jobs at the bottom, jobs at the top, the middle is hollowed out. Everybody in this room pretty much is looking for those jobs at the top, and certainly not the jobs at the bottom, but it does put pressure on you to get degrees from schools like Johns Hopkins in order to get those jobs. But even within the top, there's a differentiation, which is why we hear the middle class complaining about the 1% and the 0.1%, because that skewing of income is taking place even within that top income bracket. The lady on the left here is Elizabeth Billington. Anybody know who she is? This is my trick question. For those economists here, she is the person about whom Sherwin Rosen wrote his Superstar paper. Elizabeth Billington was a star of the London Opera in 1801. No prizes for no demerits for not guessing who she is. Nobody heard her. There was no recording at that time. She did fill the London Opera House, so over a season she made a ton of money, between 10 and 15,000 pounds, which in today's dollars would be $1 million. Now, the lady on the right, she's more familiar to some of you. That's Taylor Swift. She made $170 million in 2016. Now, that's 170 times what Elizabeth Billington made. Even though Elizabeth Billington sold very high-priced tickets for that time in the London Opera House, while many of us have never been to a Taylor Swift concert, but we've downloaded her songs. And sometimes we pay for that downloading. Her latest song downloaded on YouTube 5.5 billion times. And just multiply that by a little bit, and you get large sums of money very quickly. The point is today we access a global economy. In that global economy, people will pay a lot to hear the best, and maybe somewhat less to the second best. But the 100th best, probably not very much. And that's the sense in which we have a superstar economy. That is, the best lawyers, the best doctors, the best professors get paid an enormous amount of money. But if you're moderate, you're much further down on the income scale. And what this means for communities, I'll come to in a second. When I said technology has changed markets, I said it has made markets more global. That has an immediate effect on government. Why? Because markets and government, people think are opposed to each other, are substitutes. And that was much of the debate in the 20th century. In fact, what you see is markets grow together with government. That in fact, as markets expand, government also expands. The richest countries have the biggest government. They also have the most flourishing markets. Why does that happen? In part because governments grow to buffer the volatility. A big part of government is the social security and safety nets it creates. But also governance structures have to expand. When a bank entirely worked within a community, capital requirements were set for the bank at the community level. When the bank became statewide, capital requirements were set at the state level. When it operated nationwide, it was set at the national level. And today, it operates across many nations. Where are capital requirements decided? In Basel, by the Basel Capital Committee, right? So, in other words, governance has kept moving up as markets have expanded, just because there is a sense in which markets want harmonization, common standards, etc. There's an inexorable trend upwards. But what that does is it disempowers everything on the way, right? It takes powers out of the community, takes it up, takes it up. The community today has no control over a national bank that operates in it. because it doesn't do anything, doesn't do any regulation. It just accepts the presence of the national bank, for example. The third thing that has happened as a result of the ICT revolution is because of what I said has already happened as far as incomes. Incomes have become more skewed. If they have become more skewed, every upwardly mobile parent wants their kids to have the best chance of getting those high incomes. What does that mean? The pressure to give them really good schooling has increased. And it's there across the board in every country. The pressure to school your kids really well has increased, much more than it used to be in the past. Now, if you're an upwardly mobile couple in a suburb of a city in the US, and you're thinking, where do I find the best schools for my kids? Well, typically the best schools are schools where your kids are surrounded by other well-prepared kids. What indicates whether a kid will be well-prepared? Well, typically the professional level of their parents, the education level of their parents, basically whether their parents speak a lot of words at home, typically professional parents speak a lot more than working class parents, whether the parents spend time with their kids, whether they sort of make them do interesting things, whether they care about their nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. Typically, early childhood upbringing has an enormous effect on your subsequent development. Where do you get the best classmates with the best early child upbringing? Typically in the richest district you can afford. So what do you do as a parent who wants the best to do the best for their kids? Move to the richest county or district that you can afford to live in, because that's where the best public schools would be. If you're in a city where there's no scope of moving, you try and move them to the best private school that you can afford, because that's where they'll get the best surrounding. The point here is that the pressures of technological change, especially the emphasis on skills, is creating a meritocracy. But in that meritocracy, only the children of the successful can succeed. It's becoming a hereditary meritocracy. Why? Because the successful are seceding into districts of their own where they're surrounded by other rich people, and a variety of impediments to mobility, such as zoning laws, prevent the rest from following. So if you look at the United States, there used to be a lot more mixed communities, mixed income. It's branching out. Many more communities which are very rich, communities which are very poor, far fewer that are mixed. And it can stem just from the fact that the successful move out, because that leaves behind a much less successful, in fact, a poor community. So the disintegration of the mixed community is another factor which has been happening. And what this does is it creates the wrong kinds of trends. For sure, the people left behind are angry. They're angry for two reasons. One, the requirements of the game have increased. You have to have a much stronger educational background or a skill background to get those really good jobs. On the other hand, because of the secession of the successful, your opportunity to do that is hugely hampered. And if this is happening at the same time as your county or your district has been hit by the forces of globalization and automation, so you're really in a downward spiral. The jobs are disappearing, your schools are terrible, your social fabric is disintegrating, you have unemployment, you have far more teenage pregnancies, far more broken marriages. That's the kind of community disintegration that is happening. What do you expect people in that neighborhood to start feeling other than anger? And they basically feel the system's not working for them. But then the fact that they're angry, the fact that they need change, doesn't necessarily mean the solutions that are being offered to them are in fact the right ones. The most compelling solution seems to be, look, I feel your pain. What we need to do is to block trade from other countries, erect protectionist barriers, and also prevent those immigrants from coming in. Now, I'm all for controlled immigration, but stopping immigration is problematic from the perspective of industrial countries, but also stopping trade. And I'll tell you the reasons why that is problematic. First, as I already argued, 4 out of 5 jobs are lost due to technological change. Only 1 out of 5 is typically due to trade. Put the barrier up to trade, you still are going to lose jobs. because of automation, unless you try and find some way to put a barrier against automation. It's not clear that we know how to do that, right? The Luddites used to break up the machines, but it's not clear we can go around breaking up all the machines that exist. Second, populations in industrial countries are aging. As a Korean sort of director at the IMF told me, wealth is a great contraceptive. And what happens is people don't have kids as they get wealthier. And what we have in many industrial countries is huge entitlements that were promised in times of strong growth, which are coming due now as populations age. But the pyramids of population are, of course, inverting because there are more and more aging people, fewer and fewer people in the workforce. So those entitlements are going to be unaffordable unless we refresh the workforce with people who are younger and from outside. This is what the United States has been doing for the last 30 years, but it is something that is hard to stop. Otherwise, you get rapid aging and a rapid unaffordability of the entitlements. So a country like the US with high unfunded entitlements really has to think about it, sensible immigration if it needs to make sure that these entitlements are in fact paid. And of course, one of the problems with erecting barriers today is as populations age, the experience of Japan suggests demand is no longer found domestically. You have to start exporting to other countries. You become dependent on external demand. If we erect trade barriers to the goods of those countries today, how receptive are they going to be when we want to export goods to them maybe 5 or 10 years down the line when we find our own domestic demand is low? The point is an open world will serve everybody much better, and it's the growth of the rest, the young countries in the world, in Africa, in the Middle East, in South Asia, which will be responsible for elevating world growth down the line. And it's a bad idea to essentially block yourself off from those countries today. And lastly, we have pressing problems like climate change. And how do you deal with these problems when at the same time you're breaking up the world order by erecting barriers? So I would say we want to preserve the markets, the open integrated markets, but we need to think about how to do it given the kinds of concerns that people have. And I will end with this and move to a discussion. The way to do this is in part to push power back, the power that has migrated up beyond our borders to the international arena. One reason why you have the strong vote for Brexit, we want to take control back because too much power is embedded in the European Union. I would say it's time to think of whether we've made global governance the enemy of globalization. Can we bring governance back into countries, have more of a democratic say, and even within countries, bring them back from the national level to the regional to the local level, so that local people who are affected very differently by the forces of globalization can, in fact, achieve local solutions which are more relevant, right? One of the things people ask me in this book is, what is your grand government program to solve this? And the answer is, I don't have a grand government program. Because I don't think the answer is going to be a grand government program. It is going to be more a bottom-up process of seizing the reins and developing. At the national level, I think you take back power, but you exercise it responsibly. I call for responsible sovereignty. It's not that every country tries to become great again. That would only lead to conflict. What it is that we try to make the world great again by working together. So that's the responsible sovereignty. It doesn't mean you give up your sovereign powers, but you exercise your sovereignty for the common good occasionally. And I talk about civic nationalism at the national level. That is, let the nation not be about ethnic identity or about majoritarian identity. Let it be about a set of values that you want to propagate. That's, I can explain this more later. But push more power down to the community level. Excuse me. Excuse me. Sorry, there's something in the air. The community becomes the vehicle by which cultural aspirations, etc., are expressed, not at the national level, but the community level. Pushing more power to the community allows it to do that. But at the same time, I don't think any of us want to go back to the segregated communities of the past with high walls around them. So I would say communities with low walls around them, low enough to give people a sense that they belong, but not high enough to exclude. Allowed for the free flow of goods and services across the community borders as well as of people. Now, is this a contradiction in terms, pushing more power into the community, but at the same time requiring it to be inclusive? At some level, this is what the founding fathers in the United States had in view when they created the states, or when they created the separation of powers within the state and the center. The states have a lot of leeway in determining things like how they produce, what they produce, etc., as well as regulating production. But they have no ability to stop goods from another state from coming in, right? In other words, what you have is what is called the Commerce Clause, which is Congress is going to regulate trade between states. The states can do whatever they want on how they produce, but they can't stop the flow of goods and people across state borders. That's what I have in mind for the community. At the community level, there are a lot of powers that are delegated to the community, but make the community inclusive, allow it to access the flow of goods and people. In other words, markets in the state operate within the community also to integrate the various communities within the nation. Let me stop there, and happy to answer questions as we go into the discussion.
Thanks, Raghu. Thanks for coming, and thanks for presenting in a very succinct way your ideas. I want to, first of all, congratulate you with a quiet sense of amazement and admiration. My Kindle edition goes 397 pages, I think. No charts, no graphs. You've got a lot to say. Now, let me ask a few questions that come to mind from listening to your presentation, and then I think we'll have a lot of questions about how to fill in the details. One was a very clear demarcation between your three pillars. Especially, I was interested in the one between markets and community, and certainly in a parenthetically. In interest of clarity, I grew up in I don't know if a city that started out about 60,000 in Iowa and grew to about 90,000 while I was growing up, if that qualifies as a community or if that's already too big. But certainly the characteristics of what I think of community were very closely intertwined with the local businesses. Those were not distinct. And even in big cities, we find people finding social life, even marital partners, etc., through their work. Do you see a separation, or how do you view that?
No. This great point. I mean, this is the traditional problem of trying to simplify, right?
Yeah.
There are various ways these things are blurred, and obviously, within trading groups, there are communities that form of traders who work with each other often. The diamond traders in India are an example. I have a little bit of that in the book. But they form community relationships within business also. But the broader point is these forces do operate, and sometimes they coalesce. But what I have in mind is really the political, economic, and social aspects of people. So the individual is at the middle of that triangle. And these forces sort of operate. Sometimes they get closer together. Sometimes they're more separate. In the ideal arm's length market, there are no relationships. I pay you exactly what you ask, what I think it's worth. Yeah. And it's competitive, so it's exactly what it's worth. And if I never see you again, we're both satisfied. Now, I mean, in the real world, there are some markets which work like that. When I trade on Charles Schwab, but of course, there are some markets where it's much more intimate. So, absolutely no problem. In fact, what I think is part of the solution is more sort of interest taken in the community by local businesses, right? They have the ability to engage a little more in some of the community's activities. And you see that successful community revival sometimes requires the engagement of local business with local community leaders, education leaders, et cetera.
Yeah, in fact, that's exactly where I was going. You've described a set of factors that drew power and drew responsibilities up to a higher level and away from communities, right? And then you were talking about a need to push back, and I was sitting there thinking, wouldn't it be generating the countervailing forces if that's a superior solution to take back control, not to steal a phrase from another country in another context, that would happen organically. And that leads me, I don't know if you've been familiar with some columns that David Brooks has been writing about in the New York Times, but has been describing exactly this kind of community partnerships that I think you mentioned, and I know you mentioned in your book. Is what you're describing anticipating something that is going to happen organically because it's a superior solution, or is it something that you think is going to require compulsion?
No, look, I would be all for voluntary solutions if they emerge, and I think some will emerge. And we already see some partnerships, for example, Detroit, where you're reviving the community based on partnerships. I do, however, think that we have a bias, having, like you, sort of worked in these organizations. There is a bias in thinking that these things require a professional solution, a professional agreement at the very top, and that left to themselves, the countries themselves won't be able to figure it out, or the communities themselves won't be able to figure it out. Yeah. There's a very important principle in the European Union called the principle of subsidiarity, right? Subsidiarity, which is decisions should be taken at the lowest level, consistent with making a reasonable decision. That's a very good principle because it says push the decision down to the lowest level you can. There's some decisions which have to stay up there, but most can be taken down there. In truth, it's observed only in the breach, that too many decisions are elevated because there's a sense we don't trust them to do the right thing, or we need more harmonization. I'll give an example as a bank regulator I've always wondered about. Why do we need the same capital regulation across countries? There's some early belief that if we don't impose this, somebody will cheat, and their banks will have low capital. Well, there's an easy way to deal with it. If they ever come into my country, this is the capital requirement they have to have. If they're competing outside in some other territory, they will set the capital requirement there. Why do we need to harmonize capital requirement? Why can't we have each territory determine what its capital requirement is? Oh, but we have global banks, they have to operate across multiple jurisdictions. Well, increasingly the trend is to require them to incorporate separately in each jurisdiction. This is a largely technical discussion, but just to say that it's not obvious to me that we should have common capital standards across the world for every bank there is, with a few tweaks here and there for the really big banks. But what's the need for harmonizing capital requirements? But yet we've done it with a view that somehow if we don't do it, somebody's going to cheat somewhere, and that's going to be problematic. Well, in this day and age when there is so much transparency about this process, basically each sort of area can have its own capital requirements, and that decision can be taken by the people of that country. That's one example, but there are other examples I talk about in the book. For example, we have the same property rights for drug companies across the world. Why should every country protect patents for 20 years? Well, because we all agreed to a grand international agreement in the 1990s. It was called TRIPS. And some people argue it was largely written by Merck. But it was written in closed doors far away. No country actually had to opine on it. And it was imposed willy-nilly because that was the price of staying in the international trade agreements. Now, do we need that, or are countries sort of right to say, well, this was not a democratic process? That's the sense in which I mean people who will feel more empowered if more is pushed back to them. And I agree entirely with you, not everything can be pushed back. But what we should think about pushing back in order to save the larger concept of free trade.
Now, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, of course, you've emphasized here in your presentation and also in the book the importance of early childhood formation, including schooling. And of course, in American context, we know that schooling is by and large a local responsibility, although you mentioned here today, increasingly the funding comes from different levels. I'm sure you're familiar with the American public finance economist Thibault, who said that there were a tendency in an American city that folks who had different tastes in public goods would tend to agglomerate in for example, in suburbs. And you look around and you say, oh yes, if you're in New York, you want good schools for your kids, you go live in Scarsdale, or you move to Greenwich, or et cetera, et cetera. And of course, then that ran up against the sense, wait a minute, that's perpetrating inequalities by restricting important public services to people who not just have a taste for it, but can afford it as well. That produced the countervailing force of saying, no, we have to have an equalization, everybody the same. How do you adjudicate that in a sense, in your restoration of community?
I think it didn't matter so much when education didn't matter so much. As education has started mattering more, as it becomes the ladder to opportunity, the desire for equal access has increased. I can't get to that good university if I go to a lousy school in the first place because my SAT scores are also pretty bad, having been sort of held back right through.
Or your parents can't bribe the sports.
Well, that too. Yeah. But I think we are so scandalized by that. But it seems to me, way before that, there are so many differences in opportunity.
Yes.
I mean, let me not go there. So, but the broader point, I think, is that America has worked always on equal access, and that's because there's been more pre-market support, equal access. Way before there was a requirement of high school education, it was free high school education for everyone. Earlier, only the middle class benefited from that, but eventually the working class benefited. And in that wave of immigration in the early 1900s, when you had really good plumbers, carpenters, really experienced craftsmen immigrating in from Eastern Europe, American native-born kids could still sort of outshine them in the factories because they knew trigonometry, they knew algebra, while these kids coming in didn't. So that was the sense in which education prepared everybody for the better jobs, not the old plumbing jobs, but the new factory high-paying jobs. And so I think that worked really well, but it meant equal access. Today, right from the beginning, you have unequal access. Even though universities like mine admit any kid who does reasonably well and says we are need blind, we actually provide scholarships, and we do. The problem is getting into that first rung. And you've already been held back by the early school you went to, et cetera. So Scarsdale is very different from inner city New York. How do you fix this? Well, actually, Chicago has an interesting line, which is that in order to keep the secession of the successful from happening, what we do is in each school, primary school, you have a few places for the top few reserved in the magnet schools. So it's not an entrance exam like the Stuyvesant School. Entrance exam, yes, for a few kids, But there's also, if you're doing really well in your class, you get accepted into these good schools. So there's more equalization of the inequality that starts early by essentially giving more people place in these good schools. You still have meritocratic schools because they still have entrance exams, and the kids that come in are really the top in their class, but they may be the top in the class in different level schools. And so they do benefit. There is more diversity. There is more access to opportunity. But we need to think about things like this to keep schools mixed. Texas has a very good program where the top few in every school get to the state university, regardless of what their performance is. Now, I don't think you can stop there. You have to also, in the cases of weak schools, give them remedial training. But I think that's a good way of ensuring that it's not just the kids from the elite schools who get a lift up.
Yeah.
We also need to think, I don't think money is the only thing. I think this equalization of students' capabilities, of having good students in every school, is part of the answer. If you have demotivated and poorly prepared students in a school, no amount of money is going to make the difference in getting them to upgrade their quality.
Interesting. As I think about it, quickly interject, and then we turn to the audience because I'm sure you've got questions. In my case, in my hometown, I realized when I thought about it that because there were no private schools, so those parents who were particularly motivated and able to support good schooling and insist on good schooling created a public good in essence, because they insisted the schools be good for their kids, and that meant the schools were good for everybody's kids. But then you get to
that was the integration, right? The mixed community. It was the middle class pushing for higher quality, which ensured higher quality for everybody.
Exactly.
And that's not happening because we are seceding.
Yeah. Yep. Well, let's start right here. Wait for the microphone. Please introduce yourself, make it a question, and we have limited time, so please keep it succinct. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm John Sine. I'm a student here at SAIS. My question is, are there differential norms or values that underlie communities that contribute to their well-being? And I'm thinking of Adam Smith's work, Theory of Moral Sentiments, underlying, like, markets don't just exist in a vacuum. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that. Are they differential? Should we do something to help foster certain values? If so, what?
So I think the answer to your question, the first question, are there differences? Yes, of course. And you can see it in what the Europeans deem is civilized behavior versus what Americans think is civilized behavior, right? There are big differences even in sort of cultures that are fairly similar. Forget differences between Asian or African cultures. So there are differences. And that does permeate the market. That does affect how people treat each other in the markets and what they think is reasonable. And I teach a case where you have an American investor who goes to try and make changes in Japan, corporate governance changes, and he finds he's getting no, because they're talking different languages. They're trying to work for different constituencies. They think corporate responsibility is actually very different. Because they're coming from very different. So that does exist. Now, how does one make change? That's the more difficult part, right? Because it's something that a culture organically adapts to and changes. I certainly find it very hard I find it easy to talk about ethics, but is it easy to teach ethics, to mold somebody's ethics? I don't know that we know how to do that. We can give them examples, but the underlying values may already be formed early on in the way they think about issues. So I don't know if we can change the value system in a society. I do know it changes, and it changes based on signal events. It does. I mean, in India, for example, and this is a point I make in the book, it used to be in the 70s or the 60s, you wanted to describe a villain, it used to be a businessman with a cigar in one hand and a glass of whiskey in the other, at the races with a mall nearby hanging around. That was the businessman, right? Today, the businessman is more likely to be a hero. He and his significant other are jet-setting around the world. They're both very successful. I mean, you can see all the values that have changed. Women are now empowered and in business, but business is a good thing, not a bad thing. Flip side, I mean, I think if you look at Hollywood's depictions of sinister, what is sinister? It's nowadays typically a large corporation. So, I mean, these things change over time. And I mean, what struck me as particularly hilarious was the Lego movie, which essentially has, Lego movie is to sell Lego toys to kids, right? What more corporate motive could there be? But the villain of that piece is a Lord Business. So,
A very subtle touch. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Raghuram Rajan. I'm a journalist in Washington. Just coming from the IMF and World Bank meetings, this event is very timely because experts and top economists like you are in town from around the globe. My question is, you have done a great job when you've been running the economy of India, and it is much better than since you left the country. My question is that we have been talking in India, billions and billions of dollars black market money going out of India in Swiss banks. And everybody was talking that this money will come back from the Swiss banks and all that. My question is that if that money is outside India, is it black market money, how it can come back, or how big is the corruption problem in India? And finally, what is the future of economy of India? Thank you, sir.
okay, that's about 3 days worth of,
Yeah, I was gonna
of
say.
answers. Let me quickly say on the black money, I think it's very hard to estimate the amount of and what is black? Is it untaxed? Is it just evaded the exchange controls? The various definitions of black. So very hard. I don't know how. I've seen reports of people trying to estimate it. It's very crude. What is true is, like every other country, there's probably some money outside. And when Indian prospects improve, some of that money comes back into the country. And when Indian prospects don't look so good, some of it goes out. Longer run, I mean, to the extent that it is money that is just about exchange controls, I think India will see less of that because it is liberalizing and allowing money to go in and out more freely. To the extent that it's tax evasion, I think the grouping of the OECD countries coming together to try and stop sort of tax evasion of various kinds will be beneficial, and India should participate in that to narrow the scope for evasion.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, behind. There's student first. Students first.
Hi, my name is Vasu, and my question was about, part of your solution seems to be about pushing governance down the order to local communities. And as I'm sure you're aware, in 1993, there was that major law in India doing exactly that, the Panchayati Law Act. The results have been, to put it charitably, they've been mixed. So I wanted to know why you thought that experiment didn't work, and if it had something to do with the fact that the smaller the community gets, the shallower the pool is from which they get to pick their talent to run matters in an increasingly complicated world.
Yeah.
So just your thoughts on that.
Well, first, the Panchayati Raj is still work in progress. Not very many powers have been pushed down, but most important, funding hasn't been pushed down in a serious way. Second, I don't know why we would not, on what basis we sort of judge whether it's a success or not. One of the very interesting things is there's much more local participation. And in fact, the entire pool of politicians now sort of have a proving ground at the local level. And then as they show their spurs, show their abilities there, they move up to higher levels. So it is now becoming a training ground for people to start showing leadership. I do think it's also helped women tremendously in India because there are women now who are being elected to those positions. And there are studies showing that in those areas, there's been more attention paid to women's rights. But I think for the point about, yes, it's a smaller talent pool, I mean, to some extent, that is a constant elite view, that if we allow those guys to have any powers, they'll first, they're venal, they'll be corrupt, and second, how can they be as talented as we are? And that I mean, you pick the economic reason for it, which is we're picking from a larger pool. But locally, they know what the local problems are. And to that extent, they are in a better position to develop solutions, but also persuade other people that the solution makes sense. So I think there are offsetting forces. And historically, if you've looked at strong communities, they tend to sort of have some modicum of internal governance, which allows them to sort of elect good people, but also keep them in check by monitoring them closely. What I argue in the book is we have much better technologies to do this today. If money is coming from the center to the community, you know how much there is because the center can disclose it. And how they spend it, well, it can be put online. If the guy says I've spent 200 grand on a wall, well, where's the wall? The local community knows there's no wall. The guy at the center doesn't know there's no wall.
Yeah, but, yes, in the back. Yeah, you.
Really an extraordinary book and a wonderful presentation.
It's working.
It's working.
I was just wondering about, the dynamics of, what happens at the macro level and what happens at the community level. So what I mean by that is that let's say the economy is doing well, the desire, and so the ability then, let's say at the central level to provide funding, to develop communities and so on is there, but then the desire at the community level may not be as pronounced as the opposite case, where the economy is not doing well, the communities want to do something, and yet, there's also more, there are less resources available. And secondly, also there may be a tendency for at the community level to say, well, this is a problem, the center has to take care of it. So they sort of trade-offs and the dynamics. Now, maybe this is a structural issue, or maybe it's a sort of cyclical issue. I wasn't quite sure how one should view this.
Well, you're saying that in bad times, communities have an incentive to come together, which they may not have in good times. And therefore, it may be that in bad times, when the communities desperately need action, there may not be resources available for that action. It's possible. I do think the problem today is not a cyclical problem, as it's not communities going up and down. It's that these communities have been falling off for a long time. And so really in many of these cases, it is to change the nature of what's going on in the community. I mean, at this time, as I said, the bottom decile is declining even further. Why aren't we using this time to try and shore up those communities, to try doing something about it? And obviously, when I say we, I mean the communities have to figure out, okay, we need to make a change, right? And we need to find ways that we can support that change by offering. Yesterday, I was talking to somebody from the Philly Fed. One of the things they do is bring communities together to talk to one another to see what has worked in your community versus what has worked in my community. And they are seeing some success stories emerging. But instead, what we have is a grand central program. We're going to reduce the cost of capital for investors who invest in your community. That's the opportunity zone idea. But that can only be one part of a broader community program. We've seen from the history of aid to countries that aid doesn't solve any problems if the country itself doesn't want to pick itself up.
Right here. Here comes a. Oops.
Well, I didn't talk about that, and
Yeah.
it wasn't about that. But
not
it
the
was.
topic of this.
Let's put it this way: the idea was to re- penalize those who had hidden away cash. And long story short, the net effect was they found ways to bring it back into the system, and there was no penalty.
Yes, this gentleman's been anxious.
I want to go back to your question of the elite having access to the better facilities and resources, and therefore the children become better equipped to become elites, and therefore perpetuating that system. And how do you see this playing out, first of all, in Europe, in countries like Sweden and Norway and Denmark, and think, what are they doing? Is it also going to follow the track or not? And the second thing is that what does one do about it? I mean, you're basically saying that maybe there are some sporadic efforts are being made to cross-pollinate a little bit. I think it probably needs a much more determined effort, because the problem is so large. And therefore, what can be done? Government resources being allocated, or there are lots of things we've tried, but I'd like to hear from you as to what you thought about it.
It is a important, difficult problem. The question is what is feasible and what is ideal, right? I mean, this is one of those problems where moving, as John said, is an externality, or staying is a positive externality for others in the community if you're really good, but your leaving imposes a negative externality on those who stay. How do you fix this? Well, Singapore fixes it by mandating that government housing be really mixed. Mixed in terms of people living together. The Malays live with the Chinese origin, live with the Indian origin, but also different income groups live closer together. They go to the same schools. So that income divide doesn't show up in their schools, and they get, Singapore schooling is really very good. But that, how many countries will agree to force schooling? But maybe what you can do is eliminate some of the attempts to segregate oneself. So zoning laws, for example. Today in a number of US districts or counties, zoning laws say you have to have a house of at least 2 acres in size, no multifamily homes allowed. Put a few of these restrictions and you ensure no poor people can live there because the houses are unaffordable for them. What that does is prevent the movement. Now, you asked about Europe. I think in the integrated countries in Europe, that kind of housing inequality is much less. There's much more sort of availability of low-income housing in middle-income communities. And so that if you get that integration, you have less of a problem. Now, in the US, it would happen by trying to get rid of some of the most egregious zoning laws. California is trying to do this with bill after bill, trying to propose a more mixed living because they see the consequences of pricing the teachers, the policemen out of the communities which they serve in. So I think we will see change, but the question is how much change will society tolerate? And do people want to go towards the Singapore solution, or do they want sort of more market-based or mild regulatory changes?
Okay, we're running out of time. I think I see three questions. We'll take them all together. Then
and quick answers.
And quick answers. Well, you can take as long as you want, but
Real
thumb up.
quick
questions, please.
Quick footnote. Subsidiarity is actually Catholic social teaching. Preceding, it was first coined in the encyclical of Pope Paul the 11th. 40 years. Second question is, do we really even have local communities? Just because you have local proximity or local unit demarcations doesn't mean you have a local community. With the technological interconnectedness that we now have, it seems that really we're going more to an overclass, underclass situation than anything where you can even identify a community that has shared values that could be used to offset in your triangle, balance and rebalancing. So I just asked that question if the idea of community really isn't obsolete now.
My name is Max. I'm a site student here. Thank you, Dr. Rajan. My question is on workers left behind by technological forces. I was just wondering, aside from their economic anxiety, if some of them are permanently unemployed, how do they find identity and value in an age where they're forgotten by technological change? Thank you.
Last question.
Good afternoon. I'm Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington, D.C. My question is, in the world that we live in today, there are a few very, very powerful countries whose leaders are the quintessential essence of what it means to be a citizen of the nation that they represent, like what it means to be Chinese, what it means to be a Russian, what it means to be Indian. And when you mentioned the transformation of India over the past 30 to 50 years with women gaining more access to education, how would you describe President Modi to someone who doesn't know him at all, and his leadership style and what he's meant to India over the past few years? Thank you.
Okay, let me answer those questions as best as I can. On the issue of, do we have a community at all? I think we do still in many places. I think we strive to recover it. Even if we don't know our neighbors, we try and find out, make links with parents of our kids' classmates, because we want to establish a social sense. Is it harder? Yes, it is getting harder. I don't think online relationships substitute fully, unless there is some physical relationship also. Yes, we are in touch with professional colleagues, and that's stronger today than it used to be. My kids are in touch with their classmates from school, and that's stronger than it used to be. But those are old relationships on which we build with the new channels of communication. I do think that as far as local institutions like schools, etc., go, still the local community is the most important in figuring out how they work. And so while that is important, they will be important. When we go to everybody being homeschooled based on something on the net, then we will have lost that. But I think it'll be a long time before we get there. But on your point that it's harder to maintain that community, absolutely. But I think society keeps trying to regenerate stuff. One of the biggest problems in industrial countries is going to be loneliness. 20% of people in the US don't talk to anybody else during the day. And you just have to see how bad the effects of loneliness can be by just walking to a hospital. Look at some of the old people there who have nobody to help them. And you understand this cannot be a terminal state for society. So my sense is we will figure out new ways of reconnecting, even though there's pressure on the old ways. You mentioned church. Well, church used to be the old way. Increasingly, people don't go to church, but now they go to yoga clubs and whatever. We're always finding new ways of being in touch with people. On the permanently unemployed workers, big issue. And I think in the same way as Hannah Arendt talked about the disengaged being sort of fodder for the nationalist movements, they're looking for a sense of community. Their own community is breaking down, and it's logical that some of them, the economically disaffected, would be not just the unemployed, but those who think that others are stealing a march on them, would want to go towards these ideas of larger community and nationalism. So that's certainly a concern. I don't know how to respond to the question on Prime Minister Modi. I mean, he portrays a sense of robust nationalism, which I think you referred to, and is similar to some other leaders in the world who do that. Is he seen as? In what way is he seen? I think at this point he's seen as a prominent politician who's got a mixed record in India on the economic front, but is pushing his nationalist credentials at this point.
Thank you very much. Three quick concluding remarks. Number one, remember, as I think you all know, Raghu is also a world-class economist. So for those who say economists are those who know the price of everything and the value of nothing, he's the counterexample. Final comment is now you can understand why when I had arrived back at the fund to take over as first deputy, and Raghu came to tell me that Chicago was dragging him back to the groves of academe, I was awfully sorry to see him go, but I'm awfully glad to be able to welcome him back
Well,
back
thank
here.
you, John.
Thanks.
You were a great boss.